and welcome to the Teaching Together podcast, where we celebrate and share the glows and grows of teacher life. I'm Sierra, and today I'm joined by a special guest, Tom Mahoney. Thanks for joining me, Tom.
No worries. Thanks. It's good to be here.
I have been really looking forward to this for a while now, and I came across your profile on LinkedIn a few months ago when you were putting a call out for teachers who might be interested in being part of your PhD research. So I was wondering, without giving away the whole episode, if you could share with our listeners a little bit about what your PhD is focusing on and sort of how you came to land in that space.
Yeah, my PhD is currently focused on the relationships between critical reflection on educational ideologies and teacher agency. And that all came about really from an investigation of educational ideologies following my beginning few years as a teacher. As a graduate teacher, I entered into teaching at an independent school that was quite high performing and quite high fee paying as well. And with that, although I didn't realize it at the time, came a lot of expectations and perspectives of education that I didn't actually align with. And what ended up happening over a period of about a year and a bit is that there became increasing tensions between my perspective of education and what I wanted to do in my teaching practice and what was maybe expected of me from the school and from the parent bodies. And although it might be a bit of a crude way of describing it, the school very much followed this kind of market approach to education. You pay for an educational service and you have a right to receive that. And if you don't receive it, well, it's on the teacher and it's the teacher's fault. And so it's a long-winded journey. And if any of your listeners have heard me speak before, they might have heard me speak about this story at length in other circumstances. But what it came down to was a clash between ideologies, and my perspectives of what I believed education ought to be for came into conflict with how the structure of the school enabled certain teaching. And what ended up happening is that as a teacher at this school, I ended up being increasingly restricted in my practice. And over time, my practice got more and more constrained in terms of what I could and could not do, which meant that I couldn't actually live out the ideals that I had for my teaching practice in the way that I would have hoped when I left university. And as a result of that experience, I wanted to get an understanding of what that all meant and where it all came from. And over the last few years, since 2016, when I started my Masters of Education, I've been going on a bit of a journey to explore the different educational ideologies that come to determine what we believe education ought to be for and how it ought to function and how teachers ought to do their job. And so that's been a windy journey over the last little bit. And I started my PhD in 2021. And here we are 3 years later, and I'm finally getting to the point where I'm starting my data collection, and I've got a bunch of teachers together, and we're going on this journey together. And I guess I might leave it there, and because you'll ask me, I'm sure, a little bit more about what that's all going to look like. But yeah, that's where we are now.
I definitely will. One question that popped into my mind then when you were speaking, which I want to know, is do you feel like your personal education ideology has changed at all since your first year out of uni to sort of now? Like you felt like there was a conflict between what you believed education was and what your school's perspective was. Has that, is that something you've held to all this time, or has that also shifted as you've gained more experience and things like that? Because I feel like that's what's happened to me a little bit over the last 5 years.
Yeah, interesting. Well, that's an interesting question, as I wouldn't necessarily say that my ideology is necessarily set in stone or my perspective of teaching is set in stone. What I've come to realize over my relatively short career is that teaching is highly contextual, and how you enact your practice is highly dependent on the context that you're in and the values that come to shape that context. And that might limit what you can do. It might actually expand what you can do as well. So it really depends on the circumstances. I believe that my understanding of where problems come in education come from has been strengthened. My understanding of the ways that often our issues between different pedagogical practices are not actually a matter of whether one thing is better or not, but it actually has to do with your values about what education is for. And often we see battles between people talking about explicit instruction and inquiry-based learning. That is a pretty classic example.
Yeah.
And often explicit instruction advocates will say, well, it's more effective. But that's if you believe that education is all about being effective and efficient. And someone might have the perspective that actually sometimes the inefficient things that we do in education are actually really valuable. Things such as developing relationships with one another, regardless of whether we're able to come up with some sort of output at the end. Maybe collaborative relationships between students, even if they're ineffective, can support students to understand their place in the world and what it's like to actually relate to other people in a complex and heterogeneous world, to use a bit of a silly term there, but a world that's full of diversity, I guess you could say. And so that's kind of where things are at for me. It's not necessarily like this is the way it is and that's it. I like to think of ideologies as being something that you can be aware of as a framework to support you to be able to enact teaching in a way that supports your community, but also supports your own beliefs and what you hope to achieve through education as well.
That was one of the best explanations I've heard about the battle between explicit and inquiry learning. So for that alone, thank you very much.
No worries.
I think this is a really interesting topic, and I'm really keen to see where your research goes and just to get to experience a little bit by maybe being part of your sort of focus group, what some of the impacts of that are going to be, even just on my own teaching practice. But first, before we sort of elaborate more on these ideas and what you're diving into, I was wondering, as is our normal tradition, whether you might have a glow or grow that you could share with us to kick off.
Yeah, sure. In terms of a glow, I think this year has been a really good year for my research and sort of putting my ideas out there. I have sat in the background a little bit over the last few years of my PhD, kind of just trying to get my confirmation done and some of those milestones organized. But this year I've been able to put my ideas out there and into the world. So that's meant that I've been able to publish an op-ed with The Age and put out a blog with the Australian Association of Research in Education. And that was really positive. It sort of brought my thinking and my ideas to a few people that maybe wouldn't have received them otherwise. So that's been a really positive thing this year. And that's really challenged me to really think more deeply about what it is I'm actually trying to do. In terms of a grow, it's quite interesting. I'm going to eat my words next year because my research and my passion is all about teacher agency. And I'm a VCE mathematics teacher, and I often teach those Year 12 subjects. So you've got methods, which is your higher level, and general mathematics, which some would say is a lower level. And they're highly prescribed, really tight curriculums. You do not have much agency to work around that. There is an exam at the end of the year which determines where students rank. And so everything is tied up within this system and this competitive study score. Next year, though, I'm teaching Year 12 vocational major numeracy, which is, it used to be VCAL. And for those of your listeners that may not know, vocational major is a split off of our VCE, our Victorian Certificate of Education, where students who are looking to move into a trade or not looking to get an ATAR can complete their Year 12 certificate with more of a vocational focus. And as part of this subject, I'm going to be teaching maths to a small number of students that are entering into trades. They're only going to be at school a couple of days a week. But as part of my course, it's very open. And it allows for teacher agency for me to be able to adjust the curriculum and the learning activities to suit the needs of my students in a way that I haven't been able to do in those other subjects. So it's really exciting, but also it'll be a real interesting challenge to see how it actually works when you've got that agency and what you're able to achieve. So I'm really looking forward to that. That's going to be a grow experience for me for next year.
Yeah, that sounds very cool. Very cool. Sometimes it's like, that sounds exactly like the thing that you dream of. And then as soon as all the scaffolding gets taken away, it's kind of a little bit overwhelming. But yeah, that sounds like it'll be a great experience.
I should say there was some research done in Scotland as a result of the change in curriculum to a curriculum for excellence, which as a curriculum, it was a change towards a less scripted curriculum. And there was some research done in relation to teacher agency by Mark Priestley and Hert Biester, and they looked at the ability for teachers to be able to enact this curriculum, which was quite open-ended and quite broad. And what they did find is that a lot of teachers really struggled with it. All of a sudden, they were given this freedom, and for many of them, they wanted to come back to, what are we doing? What are the standards? And I forgot who the quote's from, but it's about a bird being given the door opens. The door's open for the bird, so the bird can go fly wherever it wants. It's got the whole world, but it decides to stay in its cage because that's comfortable and that's what it knows. And so that's the challenge. Am I going to stay in the cage or am I going to experience the world? I don't know. We'll soon find out in a year's time.
Oh, well, I look forward to hearing about how that goes. I do love asking people what's inspired them to become a teacher, especially because I think that lots of people, some people really just fall into teaching perhaps quite unexpectedly, and others have just wanted to be teachers their whole lives. So I was wondering sort of what drew you to becoming a teacher and then sort of to continue, I guess, exploring the education sector more broadly. You don't seem like you're satisfied with just what's happening in your own classroom.
Yeah. Well, in terms of becoming a teacher and deciding to be a teacher, at quite a young age, strangely enough, I felt like I knew that I wanted to be a teacher. So at around 15 years of age, I had this sense that I wanted to be a teacher, and I'm not sure where that came from. My dad's a teacher, and my mum is an astrophysicist and loves to learn and things. So I'm sure that all sort of came into it. But I was friends with someone who had a teacher. His mum was a teacher at our school, and I remember telling him I wanted to be a teacher, and he said, "You don't want to do that. My mum hates her job. You don't want to do it." And so because I was young and I was impressionable, I said, okay, that sounds about right. So I just shut it out of my mind for years and years and years. And I was convinced that I didn't know what I wanted to do following school. So I spent about 2 years just wandering in many ways until my wife, my now wife at the time, asked me, surely there's something that you want to do. And I said, when I was younger, I wanted to be a teacher. And she said, well, you should do that. And then I also listened to her. So and then I just went into it, and then I've loved it ever since. So the whole nature of teaching, it sort of grew on me as I experienced it. So when I entered into my university degree, I think we all have a perspective of what we think teaching looks like, because we've all been to school, we all have done school, and we kind of all have our own theories about what it means to teach. But my experience at university really helped challenge some of those perspectives and those beliefs, and really put me in some uncomfortable positions in relation to my beliefs about pedagogy and teaching and all that sort of thing, which have come to shape what I believe about teaching today. But really, over time, I've come to really appreciate the complexity of education and its intellectual nature. It's not just intellectual. It's full of value. It's value laden. It's full of people's beliefs about what is important. It's really full of life, and I think it never gets boring. It's complex. There's always new students and always new experiences, and there's just always something that you can gain from being in an educational environment. And yeah, it keeps me going. So that's a little bit about where I'm at. Yeah.
No, I think that's great, because there are so many teachers who do hate their jobs and who don't love what they're doing.
Yeah.
And but I think you're right. When school and education and learning is done well, it's really valuable. And I think that was something that I really stepped out of uni into my first job, sort of with this mindset of like, school should just be better. And why don't more people like school? Because I loved school, but I'm the oldest of 5 kids and the only one who likes school. You know what I mean? So I was just like, how am I the anomaly? Like, when literally every kid in Australia is sitting in a classroom almost every day, and for not most of them to be liking it, I was just, that was almost the reason that I decided to go into teaching, because I was just so convinced that it could be better. Which is, it's really hard. And now I feel like I'm maybe in a place where I feel less confident in my ideals and beliefs that I came out of uni with, but not because I don't think they're important, but because I'm maybe seeing, what you're saying, more of that complexity. And there are actually just so many more layers, and there's so many different approaches and so many people to consider. And I think there's just so much more in it than school should just be better and learning should be fun.
Yeah. And because like you're coming into school and you're coming into teaching, it's almost like you're trying to project your expectation of what schooling should be on others. And we can't control how other people see education. We can invite them and we can try to excite them and motivate them and things like that. But obviously, like you come into schooling as a teacher and you realize, oh wow, I can't actually control what people think.
No.
And it's a challenge, because all of a sudden you come face to face with the difficulty of different perspectives in education. And you can either come from that with the perspective that they're wrong, they've just got the wrong idea, or maybe there's actually more to it. Maybe it's not actually about me just doing what I want to do, but maybe there is more to it. Maybe it's a relationship, or an ecology, I guess you could say, the relationship between what we want to do and what we can achieve and the environments that we're in. It's very interesting.
It is. And I think it segues really well into my next question for you, which is, can you tell us a little bit about, how would you define educational ideologies? Could you give us some examples of them? And where do we see these play out in a school context?
Yeah, sure. So if we're talking ideology as a whole, generally the way that I would explore it is it's a system of ideas, and they determine how we understand reality, how we engage with the world, and they often claim to be like comprehensive and complete and correct. So they're the answer. And when it comes to educational ideologies, it's those systems of ideas that determine how we think education ought to be, or how education ought to look like. So for teaching, this is how teaching ought to look, and this is how students ought to behave, and this is what education ought to be for. And those ideologies come to influence policy, and they come to influence how we do our practice and how we understand our relationships between each other in educational spaces and in schooling and that sort of thing. So if we think about education, educational ideologies as this, ought factor. So what ought education look like? That's how we can kind of differentiate and understand where things become ideological or not. And if we're thinking of some general examples, there are market ideologies, or, people might be familiar with the term neoliberal ideology, that influence on education. And some people are really sick of that word, and that's fine. But we do live in Australia in an educational marketplace. My school marketizes education, and we can't pretend that that's not a function of our schooling system in Australia. And what that does is that pits schools against each other, and that comes from a belief that if we create a competitive environment where schools are ranked against one another, that it will improve quality of education overall. And what we've seen over time is that, in fact, since my school has been introduced, we haven't seen quality improve at all. All we've seen is segregation basically increase over time. So we've seen the disparity between those that are in poorer backgrounds and those on more wealthier backgrounds. We've seen that gap increase over time. And so that ideology and that way of seeing education, that, okay, if we just make it look like a market, things will be better, and that's how education should function. We can sort of look into that and actually say, is that actually working? Is that way of seeing education actually supporting our goals for students and for education in Australia as a whole? Another one that I sort of come against a bit, and as I sort of alluded to a little bit earlier on in our conversation, is this idea that education needs to be effective and efficient. And so there's a belief that education is all about being as effective as possible to support students to function in society. And depends who we're looking at in terms of who we're serving here, but often it's about filling students with as much knowledge as possible so that they can have as much knowledge as possible to be effective workers in our society, and seeing education as a function of developing workers just really doesn't cut it, especially because there's not enough jobs. We can think about education as a means of developing workers. Say recently there was some talk about and fear about students not taking high-level mathematics subjects. And the premise of it was that there are not enough scientists, or not enough people that are going to be scientists, and we need more people doing maths, high-level maths. Now, who does that serve, I guess, is the question. If we have more and more people doing high-level mathematics, are we going to have enough jobs to be able to take all those individuals? Well, no, we're not. It's probably actually going to increase the pool that these employers have to choose from. And so not everyone can be a scientist. And if we think about education as simply as a way of slotting people into workplaces, it's not going to cut it either. So that's just an example of two. But there are plenty of different ways we can see education and conceive of education that all they have their positives, but they also have their negatives and their issues that we have to wrestle with. And the increasing moves towards a science of learning and a science of education is not going to necessarily give us the educational utopia that I think is being promoted at the moment. So that's another whole conversation in itself. But that just sort of gives hopefully a bit of an indication of how we could look at some of the educational ideologies impacting Australia. Hopefully that gives some sort of starting point.
Yeah, for sure. So in light of this, you said before that your research is looking at the relationship between critical reflection and these ideologies on teacher agency, which is a lot of big words and ideas all sort of mashed together.
I appreciate that. It's
so,
yeah.
I mean, when I was thinking about that, I was like, well, firstly, because I mean, I know for me, whenever I'm doing my reports for my students, I often have to comment on their critical thinking. And I actually find it really hard to quantify that sometimes. And so, yeah, I'd love to know, I guess, as part of your research, what specifically are you referring to when you're thinking critical reflection? And how does that all relate to teacher agency? And why do you think it's so important to be talking more about this idea?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When I think of critical reflection, I also use the term reflexivity, like interchangeably. The reason I use critical reflection is that reflexivity is probably a term that not many people that are not in the academic sphere are not really aware of. And people often know about reflection. Critical reflection, they're probably, oh yeah, I think I know what that means. To get a feel for what I mean by critical reflection, I'm talking about not just looking at the technical aspects and reflecting on the technical aspects of what we do as teachers. So, for instance, how well was the timing of this activity, or how well did this grouping go, this sort of table layout go in my classroom? It's more about reflecting on the actual values that go behind the practice and thinking about what are those ways in which I see myself and my students, and how does education come into all of that. So when I'm saying critical reflection, we're thinking about, okay, what are the beliefs that direct that practice? And so, for instance, you might have a conversation with someone in the staff room, and for instance, I've had this conversation with maths teachers. We need to prepare students for exams. We need to have more exams earlier on in their schooling years. Okay, critical reflection is actually saying, not saying, oh, how can we make it more effective? It's actually saying, why would we do that? Is that really what we want to do? And why do we think that's important? And why do I think that that's important? And maybe when we actually take the time to consider those values that are behind those actions and those practices, we might actually find that they don't align necessarily with what we really want to achieve in education. And sometimes the ideological influences that come from the outside actually direct our practice in ways that we don't even really think about. Often we just think about exam practice. Yeah, cool, that's great. But we can then go a bit deeper and think, oh, why am I making my year 12s do more exam practice? Well, I want them to get better scores. Okay, and so we might want them to get over 30, get them over the bell curve. But then if every other school is doing that, that just increases the bell curve. That means every teacher is then working overtime. So then if you want to go even further, you've then got to go even more on top of that. So you've got to give even more time, more resource. And you can sort of see, okay, well, actually, is this a good thing for me to be displaying to my students as a way to live? And these ways of reflecting on our practice can actually be really transformative. And once we do take the time to think about those, we might actually realize, oh, wow, I might need to change things. And for me, it's made all the difference, because you can see from our conversation that I love what I do, but I'm not going to pretend like I'm changing the world. Okay. But I can make little changes, little things, and I can have influence here and there that means that I can align my practice and what I do as a teacher with what I believe is important. And I can't necessarily do that all the time, because that's the world we live in. And it's full of different beliefs that try and determine what education is. But when we take the time to critically reflect, we might be able to find little ways that we can actually change things. So that's why I think it's really important. It's been really important for me. And part of my research is just saying, well, is it actually important for other people, or is it just an isolated experience for myself? So that's where I sit with all that.
Yeah. And looking at teacher agency, I guess that kind of aligns with your experience of feeling like you were really restricted in what you could or couldn't do in your classroom when you first came out of uni. So, but then I guess if we think about before what we were saying about how when teachers are given more agency, they actually really find it hard. How important do you think teacher agency is? And obviously, if teachers have more agency, then they're probably bringing maybe a wider variety of ideas and ideals and beliefs into their classroom. And do you think that's a good thing in a school ecosystem to have so many different agents?
Well, yeah, I guess that's the question to ask. Do we believe education should be consistent or not? And that's a big question in itself. And why would we care about education being consistent across Australia? Maybe so that we can compare ourselves to other people. Like, is that why? Or often there are conversations that are important to have around equality and equity. So those are really important conversations. I'm not discounting those. But I think it's really important that we then reflect on that question as well, you know? And in some cases, maybe it's not such a bad thing to have different voices and different ways of enacting practice, even within the same school. I think it's important that there is some sort of common vision, but within that, I believe teachers need to have some agency. The reason being is because the students that we have in front of us are not just a homogenous group that we can just apply a singular approach and she'll be right. We are teaching students from all different backgrounds and all different places, and that's a good thing. It's actually really good that we're bringing different cultures and different people from different backgrounds together. Well, once again, that highlights my value, is that I believe that that's the way the world should be, and that's an important thing in itself. And I think teachers need to have that agency to be able to identify when something needs to change for their students. And teachers in Australia are awesome. We have amazing teachers in Australia. And we need to give teachers the agency to be able to do what is right for their students and their classes and their communities. And that's why I believe it's important, because our students are diverse and our teachers need to have that freedom to be able to maneuver around when necessary to do what works in their context, and not just do what works as a blanket, but what works here, what works with these students now, and in this place.
Yeah. It sounds like empowering teachers to be able to make those decisions is a really important part of kind of this whole idea and what you're looking at. And I think there's a lot of teachers who feel really disempowered right now. And, you know, for all sorts of reasons, some of those are because we don't feel trusted enough as professionals to make decisions. And I think that varies from school to school and what your leadership is like, and, you know, how much scope you have to make choices or how rigid your pedagogical frameworks are across the school. But also that we're really bombarded with a lot of other work that occurs outside of the classroom. You often hear people talk about that they feel like they just lack the time and space and resources to actually be doing their primary role, which is teaching and learning, as opposed to being distracted by a whole range of other things.
Yeah.
And yet schools just rely on all of that. You know, you can't really have operational classrooms and environments without the extra bits. And sometimes the best parts about schools are the co-curriculars and all the other things that we're doing, because it is almost that other side of learning that's not that really rigid at your desk. Here's the knowledge that I'm feeding you. So it would be a real shame to lose that side of schools I guess, in favor of teachers having more time to do only classroom teaching and learning. But yeah, one of the things that you are looking at using is communities of practice. And I was wondering how you feel like those, well, firstly, what they are and how you feel like those could be really used as a tool to empower more teachers.
Yeah. So communities of practice is a term or a concept used to describe something that's been happening for ages across cultures and different people groups and different ways of living and different practices. And basically, it's this a community of practice is a group of people that share a concern, and they meet together regularly to improve what they do. And within this sort of model, it sort of there's heaps to this model, but I guess I will just sort of speak to the way that a community of practice challenges some of the dominant perspectives we have around education at the moment, and some of the ways that we do professional learning. And often professional learning will go somewhere and we'll listen to an expert talk and we'll passively receive and maybe apply it and that sort of thing. A community of practice is a place where like-minded people come together around a similar concern to work out how to do this thing better. There's not necessarily one person that is the expert or one person that's the novice. Everyone has their different experiences which they're bringing to the table, and what it does is it allows for dialogue to happen, and by dialogue, basically thought through speaking. So just like we're speaking now, we're thinking, we're processing, we're working out what we believe as we talk and as we communicate with one another. And so a community of practice tries to, well, you know, my research is about teacher agency and allowing teachers to make those calls. I don't necessarily want to say, do this and this is going to change your teaching forever. I want to be like, hey, let's look at this together and let's see what happens. And I think that really exemplifies what I'm trying to do. And so a community of practice approach where we're coming together with a shared concern that we want to understand educational ideologies and are interested in how they're impacting the work of the teacher, we're going to come together around that focus. The whole idea is that we are all teachers, we've got this common concern, and we're going to reflect together on how those different ideologies impact on teachers. And so it'll be a community approach. So we're catching up regularly together as communities to just chat, just work through it, and allow space for maybe something to happen. Now notice that I didn't have a learning objective there necessarily. There's not a success criteria, because what it's doing is it's actually opening it up to say that I actually don't know what's going to happen. And we're just going to let this space, we're going to allow this space to kind of create the possibilities itself. So that's, you've kind of heard a couple of reasons. I think one, it provides a space where there is more democratic participation by participants. And two, it challenges the dominant ways that we see education currently. And, it challenges me as well. I'm in this system that is highly focused on objectives and having outcomes for everything. Whereas this is, it's like, hey, let's just give this thing a go and see where it takes us.
Some of my favorite forms of professional development that I've done have been more in that kind of space, maybe where there are kind of communities, or you get put in a small group and you're discussing some ideas. But I still feel like it's not quite hitting on sort of what you're describing in terms of, there's still a leader and there's still like a, this is the direction our school wants to head in, so why don't you talk about this kind of thing? Yeah. I'm keen to know what you think about structurally. how do you envision something like this working? Because I can really see how it would be certainly far more enjoyable professional learning. I mean, I'm a bit of a nerd and I love all PD, I can't get enough of it. But I know that that's certainly not everyone's take on it. And I think it's way more enjoyable when we're discussing and in dialogue with each other and able to hear from other people's experiences and contexts that they've been in. Do you think these communities would be happening within a school or more broadly, so that people are sort of connecting outside of schools and bringing in different contexts into the conversation? And would they be based around, a topic of discussion, or is it just kind of like, hey, what's happening for you in your classroom?
Well, it really depends. And with the community of practice, it's a really amazing concept. And Etienne and Beverly Wenger, that a community of practice is a way of understanding social learning and social relationships, which is a bit of a strange thing to get your head around. What you were describing earlier sounds a bit like professional learning communities, which we have here in Victoria, which are based on a community of practice model, but the inquiry question is defined already. Often it's predefined, and often it's in relation to student achievement, and it's sort of centered around student achievement of academic outcomes. Now, a community of practice doesn't have to focus on that. It might actually, the teachers within a community of practice might be all together on that idea. They might be like, we want to improve academic practice. And as a community, that is their focus, and that's what they choose to explore. But it's not necessarily defined by the topic itself. It's something that's, you can't necessarily say, you guys are going to be a community of practice. You can allow for that opportunity to happen. And I've been in a few community of practices where I've sort of sat there and I've thought, I'm pretty sure this is just a presentation. And there's just a lot of teachers here that are just listening passively. And we're actually not having any interaction as a community to renegotiate what we mean by certain things, whether we agree with certain things. And there's not wrestling happening. There's a lot of just compliance. Now, I'd argue that's not a community of practice. A community of practice is when, and especially when we're talking about teachers and education, is when teachers are coming together and they've got a shared concern. And it might just be an organic thing that happens. Often all communities of practice sort of happen without necessarily the name. They could be teachers that are interested in, integrating AI in their classroom, and they catch up and they work through it, and they feed off each other. How does this work in your classroom, and what are you working on at the moment? And so there are all sorts of ways it can sort of come together. But the idea is that it's a common concern. The idea is you want to improve your practice, whatever that might be, and that you meet regularly. So it's this, it's a community event, I guess you could say, on a regular basis. And the implications of that are quite broad, and they often have a lot to do with even the way we see ourselves in relation to each other, in terms of our practice as well. So very, that was a very, politician way of answering your question, but hopefully it starts the journey. And, as you can see, I'm getting my head around this as well. And it's not like I own what a community of practice necessarily is. I would say Etienne and Beverly Wenger Trainer own that. But I believe that as a framework, I think it's a really valuable one, which I'm starting to get my head around.
I guess a follow-up question I have for you, which kind of rolls into my last question, is, so if we're talking about a framework, if you were to say, decide on a common concern, maybe even just through a staff room conversation, and you realize someone else has kind of the same feelings or thoughts that you do about a thing, and you decide to meet up for coffee over it or whatever. What sort of, have you put any thoughts into like particular questions or things that you could use to make sure that you have like open discourse about things so that it's not just a presentation, or so that I guess the conversation actually leads to those critical reflection things that you want people to think about, rather than just maybe having a little bit of a whinge session about something.
Yeah. And sometimes a whinge session is actually really valuable and can bring a lot of stuff to light. And you did mention how, some people are really disheartened at the moment. And I wonder if that feeling of being disheartened is something that needs to be worked through in terms of the educational ideologies that are impacting our practice. But in terms of, if we want to make sure our communities of practice are centered around that, as a community, ideally the community itself would direct that. But as part of my research, and there is a sense that I am guiding some of this as well, and I'm facilitating some of this process, is that I will have a few prompt materials and a few things to get people thinking about stuff. So it might be some poetry, it might be a cartoon, it might be a video, it might be an excerpt or something to just think about. And we bring that to the table, and then we discuss it, and we try and bring it back to that sort of core concern. But I guess the whole thing is that a community of practice doesn't necessarily have to be strictly a community of practice all the time, and it needs to meet these outcomes. That's the whole thing. It's like it's a challenge, right? Because we're thinking probably from an outcomes standpoint that we need to be consistent, and that we need to have we need to be keeping in line with things. But I think in a community, we go off on tangents all the time, and we're trying to understand who we are within that. And I don't necessarily think that's any less valuable necessarily when if someone is going off track, but it's something valuable for them to help them sort of discern where they fit into this whole thing. So once again, doesn't necessarily give an exact answer. And I guess that's kind of the aim here, is that it's trying to open things up and to allow for the possibility. Yeah.
The framework is that there is no framework.
In a sense, yeah, in a sense, except for that core idea that
of what a community is, and
common concern, meeting regularly to improve practice. Those are those three things. So if it meets those three things, that's essentially a community of practice.
Do you think there's a point where a community becomes too big? Like, could it be as small as just 2 people and as big as 100? Or do you think that there's a cap kind of where it stops being effective, or is that yet to be determined?
I wouldn't be able to say. I don't think in terms of, where it, I don't think there's any sort of scientific cutoff there, but I would suggest that if it starts getting if it's over 10, it's going to be pretty hard
to facilitate discussion.
Well, yeah, you want people to have that opportunity to be able to share and open up. So I would suggest that if you can keep it between 5 and 10, that's probably an ideal community of practice. If you're going beyond that, then you almost need more structure, and you start drifting away from necessarily being a community where you can all contribute to being a system that has objectives that we're going to move along with. And I think that's the tension, is that experience that I had at that community practice. So it's just like, it's just a bunch of people in the same teaching position, just online in the same place at the same time. That was my impression of it. And, you know, who knows, like maybe someone had a different perspective, but that's at least how I interpreted it. And I think that as you get larger and larger, it might not necessarily be able to enact the same values. Yeah.
Yeah. And I realized when I asked you that question, I caught myself by asking about how effective it is.
Yeah.
And really, maybe that's not the purpose.
Yeah.
And I need to drop the value of it. Is everything always efficient and effective?
That's right.
So
That's right.
Thank you for teaching me that.
Oh, no worries at all. Every time you say effective now, you'll just be thinking, oh no. And it's not a bad thing. You know, being effective is not necessarily a bad thing, right? But it's about reflecting on that as a value and thinking, is that actually important?
I think that's a fantastic place to land, and a great question for us to walk away from thinking about as we head into our classrooms, and what do we really think is important, and you know, is the priority always to be effective? I think maybe not. Maybe not. Which is a real struggle for me.
Yeah, look, and I must, you know, I'll put it out there on the table. When I was initially doing my research and putting forward my research proposal, initially the structure of my research project was going to be professional learning, and I was going to be presenting. And my supervisors, who are amazing, challenged me on that and said, you know, maybe you should have a think about that. You know, think about the values behind that. Like, why do you want to do it? You know, what are you worried about? Are you worried that they're not going to get what you want from them? You know, and that sort of set me thinking about, oh, wow, okay, that actually, you know, I'm so ingrained in the ideological perspectives of my environment, that I couldn't actually necessarily see that just myself. So having those people and having that community of practice means that you can speak into things like that as well. So you know, it's a journey we all can go on, and it's not a bad thing.
No, I think, if I'm just thinking, like, again, about a typical classroom experience, is like, you know, the conversation I've had before with teachers in the staff room. I don't know about your school, but, you know, it's often I'll have to share a classroom with people, you know, like I don't always have my own classroom that I can set up exactly that I want. And, you know, in the past I've had debates about, well, you know, I'd like the desks arranged in groups, and they'd like them arranged, you know, in pairs because it's less distracting, you know, but I tend to do more group work. And, you know, there's all these back and forths, and it ends up being into a big, you know, debate about, you know, which way is better. And, you know, how we say that as schools in Australia, we value 21st century skills like, you know, critical thinking and problem solving and collaboration. And yet most of us would try to avoid that because it's not effective or efficient always when we're trying to just transfer knowledge. And I think, that's something that, I've felt challenged to think about through this discussion, is like, well, maybe it's not an effective transfer of information, but is that what I'm wanting to be the sole purpose of what's happening in my classroom? Not usually, actually.
Yeah, wow, that's really powerful. That's some great reflections there. And this is what I'm talking about. This is, you are embodying critical reflection, and your listeners are hearing it just live. This is live, everybody. This is happening. Yeah.
As I'm thinking
this is reflexivity in action.
I won't edit this section.
Yeah, not at all.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining me and joining all of us today and sharing your experiences. I'm really excited to see where your research goes, and maybe we can catch up again and do a future episode and sort of see where things have panned out. But I think that, yeah, there's lots to think about, and especially as sort of more early career teachers, I think it's really important for us to stop and think about the reason behind what we do. And so you've really challenged me to think about that today, and hopefully other people have felt the same way. But yeah, thanks again, Tom, for your time and your expertise.
No worries. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Sierra. Appreciate it.
If you've been listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode and whether you feel like you've seen certain educational ideologies shape your practice. So you can let us know or leave a comment on Spotify or send us a message on Instagram at Teaching Together the podcast. See you later.